I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Beedie School of Business at Simon Fraser University. I'll just say a couple of things if you don't mind. I came here from University of Melbourne. It's 25 years since I actually left these wonderful shores to go explore the world, and I'm back here, and I think obviously that's made me a richer person having explored the world, and I'm back here now after 25 years in Canada. And one of the reasons why I came here is because of what the Beedie School of Business actually does. And I think it's really because of the foundations laid by former deans, obviously, and the people here. Danny Shapiro, who was our former dean, his predecessor, after which, you are very well aware of Professor Ali Dasmalchian, who was the dean before me, and of course Carolyn, who was the dean pro tem just before I took over. So you've got a lot of international business scholars here as deans, and I'm now here as a marketer. And Danny did actually say, don't talk too much about the Beedie School of Business, don't. And I said, yes, I won't. And then I said, well, I'm a marketer, so I have to say a few words, so I will. But I'll be very brief in my remarks about the Beedie School of Business. It has a vision, it's got a calling, and Ali was fabulous in terms of helping us develop that vision and calling. And so we're very grateful to him. And very briefly, our calling is really to develop innovative, socially responsible leaders with a global perspective. And we've got proof points on all three things in terms of innovation and innovativeness. We've got a Charles Chang Institute for Innovation, actually for entrepreneurship, and it is doing fabulous things, starting with high school students through to our master's students. On social responsibility, we do amazing things with with a range of activities, including the Indigenous Business Leadership program that we run, which is an executive MBA program started actually during Danny's tenure. And it is, 10 years old, actually 11 years old now, and it's been doing amazing things in the marketplace. Of course, we do a range of other things as well. Our faculty members are in the provincial and national legislatures, speaking about issues of local and national importance. So doing lots of things. But of course, from your perspective, the most relevant aspect is the global perspective that we try to endow our students with. And thanks to Jack Austin, thank you for being here, Jack, and his colleagues. We have the Jack Austin Center for Asia Pacific Business Studies. We've got a fabulous faculty doing work in international business studies. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of Jing, you've heard of Danny Shapiro, Carolyn, and of course our own Rosalie Tung, who's the incoming editor-in-chief of GIBS. So I think we've done reasonably well. We do all right here in the school. We don't scream and shout about it as much, but I think that's my job as marketer, to be screaming and shouting about it from the top of the roof, which I will be doing. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you the keynote speaker for today, who is the Honourable Senator Yuen Pau, who's of course a senator in Canada and former president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. So has some great expertise actually in international business and emerging markets and the Asia Pacific as well. Senator Wu was appointed to the Senate of Canada in November 2016, and he sits as an independent representing the beautiful province of British Columbia. He served as facilitator of the Independent Senators Group from 2017 to 2021. He's worked on public policy issues related to Canada's relations with Asian countries for more than 30 years. So I did say he's such an expert in this area, and he truly is. From 2005 to 2014, Senator Wu was President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, during which he also served on the Standing Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council and as chair of that council's State of the Region report. He also serves on the advisory boards of the Mosaic Institute, the Canadian Ditchley Foundation, and the York Centre for Asian Research. Senator Wu is a member of the Standing Joint Committee for the Scrutiny of Regulations on Foreign Affairs and International Trade and the Senate Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce. I'm also proud to say that Senator Wu is a senior fellow at our school and a member of the Trilateral Commission. So we're really fortunate to have Senator Wu here amongst us to do the keynote speech. And with that, could you please join me in welcoming Senator Wu to the stage? Welcome, Senator Wu, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Dean Kayande, for that lovely introduction. Co-chairs Ching Lee and Danny Shapiro, Professor Casanova, the Honourable Jack Austin, distinguished participants, good morning to all of you. I'm speaking to you from the nation's capital, Ottawa, which is located on the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. I'm very honored to be giving a keynote message to kick off your conference, and I only wish that I could deliver my speech in person, not least because of the opportunity to interact with participants who have come from near and far. The theme for this conference, Geopolitics, Emerging Markets, and Global Strategy, could not be more timely, and I'm looking forward to listening in on some of the sessions that follow to get insights from all of you, especially as they apply to Canada. I'm not an academic, so I will not pretend to offer a scholarly assessment of this very broad topic, but I've worked on emerging markets all my life, and I have a particular interest in the intersection of geopolitics and strategy. I hope I can offer a few ideas and some stylized propositions to stimulate your discussions in the days to follow. You know, my life story is in a small way about the intersection of geopolitics, emerging markets, and global strategy. I was born in post-colonial Malaysia. I grew up in Singapore, where I spent some years working for the central bank as an economist. I am, I guess, a product of the so-called East Asian miracle, at least the Singapore variety, that most economists would attribute to some version of an outward-oriented market-based development strategy. Per capita income in Singapore in the 1960s, when I was born, was about the same as Burma and Sri Lanka. Today, it is closer to US $60,000 per capita, which is higher than Canada. The conventional wisdom of Singapore's success story is one of enlightened leadership embracing a policy of radical openness to multinational investment at a time when many other developing countries saw foreign direct investment as an extension of colonialism and pursued more self-reliant economic development strategies. There are other aspects of this story of the so-called Singapore miracle, such as forced mobilization of domestic savings, public housing, massive investment in education, and a competent civil service, all made possible by an authoritarian state that did not shy from the suppression of political dissent in the interests of the greater good. But what we generally did not talk about was the favorable geopolitical context for Singapore's miracle economic growth, one that was built on the crucial requirement of assured access to rich country markets, particularly the United States. This was, of course, a period when open markets were increasingly seen by the global elite to be an objective good, and where trade barriers around the world were falling rapidly, partly because of the conclusion of the Uruguay round in 1994, but also because of the unilateral trade liberalization that preceded it, especially in East Asia. You know the stats as well as I do, but between 1950 and 2008, global trade expanded 50-fold, and global GDP more than 60-fold. In a sense, any developing country that chose an outward-oriented development strategy that was based on exports to rich country markets from the 70s through the early noughts could not have failed to increase welfare for its citizens. It is easy to forget, however, that there was a geopolitical context that allowed for the rapid expansion of global trade and investment. It is that With the end of the Second World War and the retreat of colonial powers such as Britain and France, a newly ascendant United States saw fit to rebuild the global order based loosely on market principles and buttressed by security guarantees, especially in Europe and East Asia. American support for open markets was not philanthropic, since US businesses benefited greatly from access to fast-growing economies, and US consumers enjoyed low-cost manufactured goods produced in developing regions of the world. But ulterior motives aside, it is fair to say that for much of the second half of the 20th century, there was a kind of Pax Americana, which benefited countries that were A, aligned with the United States Cold War against the Soviet Union, and B, pursued outward-oriented development strategies that could ride the wave of rapid global growth. Until 1989, Pax Americana was regional rather than global, but after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent implosion of the Soviet Union, there was a view that Pax Americana and the capitalist ideology that came with it would become a universal phenomenon. This was dubbed the unipolar moment, and it led to grandiose pronouncements such as the end of history. Thus began a period of accelerated globalization, not just through the liberalization of trade in goods and services, but also in the free flow of capital and, to a lesser extent, labor. It was also a time when a particular view of markets became dominant, what we now call neoliberal economics, which attributed powers of social improvement to Adam Smith's invisible hand that would have made Adam Smith choke. The point here is not to debate the merits of trade liberalization, globalization, or neoliberal economics. Rather, it is to say that these ideas were a product of a historical period that was underpinned by a particular configuration of global order, under the leadership of the United States, and more importantly, with its consent. The result of rapidly expanding global trade and investment was faster economic growth in most parts of the world, especially those places which embraced economic openness and American leadership. Even those countries that were not in the US camp, but which nevertheless signed up for the global division of labor, benefited from the rapid expansion of trade and output of the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. Think of Vietnam, which fought a bitter war against America, and above all, China, which didn't even open its economy until the early 1980s. The world is better off today because of globalization, and not just for rich cosmopolitans, but also citizens of most countries in the bottom half of the global income distribution. Inter-country income inequality has narrowed because of globalization, which is, of course, what economic theory would predict and what economists like to call convergence. But narrowing income inequality among nations has masked growing inequality within countries, especially industrialized economies, and notably the United States. All of you will recognize this as the Branko Milanovic story, which goes on to suggest that there's a connection between the improvement of global inequality and the worsening of inequality within countries. There is ongoing debate about the relative importance of import competition and technological change for the deindustrialization of rich countries, but I think it is safe to say that US politicians are placing their bets on the former, which is why we are witnessing the rise of protectionism in the United States and the effort to, quote, bring back manufacturing, unquote, to the American heartland. As just one example, the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is an example of legislation that is as much about protection against foreign competition through a variety of Buy America provisions as it is about building new infrastructure. Other industrialized countries are also trying to address the income inequality problem through redistributive measures such as wealth taxes, funding for left-behind regions, and income support for disadvantaged segments of the population, all of which are sensible policies. But the temptation to shield the country from foreign competition is often too great for politicians to resist, and we are likely to see more and more of these policies, whether they are dressed up as national security, resilience, or buying local. To this extent, the revenge of geopolitics is not just about war and peace a la Ukraine, but it is also about the grubby nature of domestic politics in industrialized countries and the pressure on politicians to address public discontent due to the uneven distribution of the benefits of globalization. While the Russian invasion of Ukraine will add a fresh dimension to the impact of geopolitics on the prospects for emerging markets, the seeds of a geopolitical reversal were sowed much earlier and had already begun to produce weeds before the Ukraine war. The pointy end of our new geopolitical reality is, of course, China, or more specifically, US-China strategic rivalry. You would have deduced from my preceding remarks that I view the rivalry primarily through the lens of economic competition rather than that of a military threat or the notion of democracies versus autocracies, never mind the rhetoric employed by politicians. China embraced the global division of labor in the 1980s and carved a niche in global supply chains that allowed it to embark on a policy of massive rural-urban migration that lifted hundreds of millions of citizens out of poverty. As Milanovic reminds us, the dramatic improvement in global income distribution over the last 40 years is largely because of China. But the corollary is that the worsening position of people in the middle to upper quadrant of the global income distribution curve, this is the downward descending part of Milanovic's so-called elephant trunk. These are the left-behind citizens of rich countries, particularly the United States. In this sense, no one should be surprised that the domestic politics of income inequality in the US is playing out as the geopolitics of Sino-US rivalry. China has become a problem for the United States because she is perceived to be a peer competitor in a number of economic and military domains. The awkward fact is that China became a peer or near peer competitor on the back of Pax Americana's twin pillars, open trade and investment, and the maintenance of peace and security in the region. Now, both corporate and Main Street America benefited massively from China's rise, not least through 3 decades of low inflation, now over, but 3 decades of low inflation made possible by Chinese workers exploiting themselves to manufacture consumer goods for rich countries, and more recently by the addition to global aggregate demand that is the 18 trillion US dollar Chinese economy. China did all of that without embracing the American order or challenging it. China was in effect a free rider, and the United States was happy for the extra vessel in the flotilla led by USS Globalization. In the last decade or so, however, USS Globalization has sailed in a different direction, and it is not clear that Washington, D.C. still wants a Chinese vessel in its wake. The reason has as much to do with China as it has to do with the United States. Since the advent of Xi Jinping in 2011, China has become more assertive in a number of ways, most of which are well known to you, so I won't spend much time on them. For example, China is actively seeking to move up the value chain by raising the relative cost of labor to force higher value-added production. They are buying foreign companies, they are trying to create brand recognition, and registering mountains of intellectual property. They are developing an industrial policy or expanding the industrial policy to focus on so-called the fourth industrial revolution sectors, also known as the Made in China 2025 policy. China is creating new markets in developing regions through foreign direct investment and infrastructure spending, including the much maligned Belt and Road strategy. China is demanding a greater say in regional and global governance institutions, as well as creating new institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Beijing is projecting its security interests in the region by expanding its naval capabilities and claiming islands in the South China Sea, as well as striking quasi-military deals with South Asian and Pacific Island nations. We all know about China's so-called wolf warrior and hostage diplomacy. And there is a sharp rise in state and non-state-led media campaigns that are a mixture of public diplomacy, nationalist pride, jingoism, and propaganda. There are many ways to criticize these actions, from accusations of stolen IP to stalking horse investments, debt diplomacy to the disregard of international law, and much more. But taken as a whole, China's newfound assertiveness internationally is consistent with that of a rising superpower, and in historical terms, not unlike earlier periods of imperial or capitalist ascendancy. Nevertheless, Chinese assertiveness runs counter to US interests, not necessarily because they are new threats in and of themselves, but because China is seen as a peer competitor, and not just any old competitor. More to the point, China is becoming a peer competitor that does not accept US hegemony, especially in the form of American forward deployment of military assets on the periphery of the Chinese mainland. To grossly simplify the rivalry, it is my sense that Washington's great fear is of a China that will overtake the US and impose its priorities and standards on the world. Conversely, the great fear in Beijing is that China will not catch up with the US and end up stuck in a middle income trap, which will then endanger the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. My own guess is that China will not be able to comprehensively catch up to the US because of its internal governance challenges, but that it will nevertheless be a formidable competitor in selected technological, economic, and military domains. The easy phase of Chinese economic expansion is over, and further growth will have to rely on extracting productivity gains from factor inputs rather than relying on so-called unlimited surplus labor. In other words, China is in what has been termed the middle income trap, from which only a small number of economies have been able to escape in the post-war period. It is for this reason that I interpret Beijing's greater assertiveness in recent years not as a measure of China becoming ever more powerful, but as a reflection of a China that worries it is starting to plateau. But even if China never achieves the level of overall wealth of the industrialized West, it has already crossed a threshold where its sheer size has a significant impact on the world. In this sense, the danger is not that China will overtake the West. It is that in pursuing a policy that is seen to be preventing China's further rise, the West will foster a resentment and hostility on the part of Beijing that will turn the current geopolitical joisting into a serious geopolitical conflict, perhaps even war. Which brings us to the war that is currently underway in the Ukraine and what it means for other emerging markets. A few weeks ago, it was widely reported in Canada and elsewhere that Western country representatives at the G20 finance ministers meeting walked out when the Russian finance minister began speaking. What was not reported was that at least half of the other members did not walk out. They included China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico, and of course, Russia. Do you recognize this list? Well, it is the famous BRICSAM. Here I add an additional I for Indonesia. But this is an acronym that is shorthand for what we believed were the most promising emerging markets, and which is, of course, what all of you are experts in. What does it say for the prospects of the BRICSAM countries that they are not aligned with the industrialized North on some aspects of the war in the Ukraine, particularly sanctions against Russia? Let's set aside the general supply and price effects of the war, especially on food and energy products, which were already stressed before the war and will be even more stressed in the months and years to come. But these will hurt rich and poor countries alike. The unique stresses that will be felt by emerging markets are those that have to do with industrialized country market access for manufactured goods and services from and capital flows to the South. The war will add political pressure for industrialized countries to restrict market access for developing country exports in the name of national security, job creation, or as a form of secondary sanctions. I've already discussed how the seeds of anti-globalization were sowed even as globalization flourished in the last 40 years. But the kinetic war in the Ukraine will exacerbate this trend by providing a fresh lens for industrialized country political leaders to wage economic war against a broader set of rivals and adversaries. Of course, not all emerging markets will fare the same, and there will be varying degrees of freedom for each to manage their participation in regional or global economic groupings. Mexico, for example, is positioning itself as a location for low-cost production inside Fortress North America. It may just pull it off. Emerging markets on the European periphery, that is to say non-members of the EU, may also get a pass in terms of preferred access to the common market for security as much as for economic reasons. But Africa and Latin America will find it more challenging, and they will have to redouble their efforts at regional economic integration. And while East and Southeast Asia could further deepen their already very high level of economic integration, the countries of the region are increasingly pressed to choose between China and the United States, while American and other Western multinationals are pressured to reshore to their home countries. Setting aside whatever military lessons emerging markets are taking from the Ukraine war, I can assure you that they are paying very close attention to the unprecedented use of economic warfare that the United States has unleashed on Russia and wondering if they could be next. If there was anything sacrosanct about globalization, it was trust in the financial and payment system that made globalization work. That trust is now broken. From an international development point of view, the question is whether the promise of convergence is dead, or to put it differently, whether the middle income trap is designed exactly to be just that, a trap. Will developing countries be able to climb the ladder of economic success which was promised to them in exchange for conformity to the post-war international order? Or would the ladder be kicked from under them just as they reach the upper rungs? This is not just a question of business strategy, which is the focus of your conference, but also of global welfare and fairness, which should concern all of us. I thank the organizers again for inviting me and wish all of you a fruitful conference.
Thank you very much, Senator Wu, for this excellent summary of what you call the revenge of geopolitics. So you highlighted all the big successes like Singapore, and I would say in China, of course, and many other countries. Let's don't remember that India is on the right path. Korea also moved from developing to developed. And even my country, Spain and Portugal, were also developing countries. So many countries benefited from this globalization era that you think that is coming maybe to an end as we know it. So I'm going to invite people in the audience to ask some questions to Senator Wu. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I am wondering, you mentioned that we have moved from a polarized world, a regional global world before the fall of the Berlin Wall, to a Pax Americana with US dominating the economy of the world. Could we move to now, again, a fragmented world in terms of standards, technology, with China on the one side, US on the other, and maybe some emerging markets, as you mentioned, like on their own? Could we move to a fragmented regional type of organization in the world? What are your views on this one?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that is a fair summary of my speech. I did not say it quite as explicitly, but the pressures for dealing with income inequality in industrialized country economies, compounded now by security concerns due to the war in Ukraine, will lead to some closing off of markets in the industrialized world, I believe, that will allow for some emerging markets to participate in the prosperity of those economies, but which will leave other parts of the developing world to, in a sense, fend for themselves. And by fending for themselves, what I mean is there will be a greater need, I think, for regional economic integration that will bring in itself different patterns of trade, perhaps different standards, certainly different kinds of production networks that are less global and more regional. We already know that to be true in East and Southeast Asia, where intra-Asian trade has grown very dramatically in the last 20 years, and probably would have gone on that trajectory for the foreseeable future, but for the accelerated US-China strategic rivalry that is now forcing a number of countries and players in the regional supply chain, production chain networks to make choices about whether they still want to be part of that production network or to disengage, to use the popular term, to decouple from the Chinese economy. The Chinese, of course, are not going to take it lying down, and they will do everything they can to protect their market access, but also to form alternative production networks that may be more regionally based rather than globally oriented. And that's partly, of course, the so-called new strategy of Xi Jinping, which has at the core what he calls dual circulation. You know, there's sort of an internal, somewhat self-reliant economy, and then there's one that is connected with the world.
Professor Ramamurthy?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for a brilliant speech. I mean, I think it rivals anything any of us could have said here in terms of its comprehensiveness and your grasp of all the nuances. There's one other major force in the global economy you didn't speak to, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the role of technology and are we at the cusp of an era in which technology is going to either make some of the issues you raised easier to address, or is it going to make it even harder?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's going to make it both easier and harder, and that's of course a kind of a cop-out answer. It's going to make it harder in the sense that supremacy in these fourth industrial revolution technologies will require some setting of standards to allow the exchange of information and operability of these technologies. I'm thinking principally of digitization and digital technologies and the infrastructure that is required for digital technologies to flourish. 5G networks being the most obvious and controversial of the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about. And so while 5G technologies will allow for a massive expansion of the use of computing power because of the ubiquity of computers in all of our devices and all of our daily happenings, it will also cause more cleavages between providers of technologies that have different standards and countries that are going to make decisions about standards based on political and security concerns rather than simply on the best technologies. So in that sense, the emergence of some of these fourth industrial revolution technologies will make geopolitics even more fraught. But there's another sense in which these technologies, I think, will also have very challenging implications for domestic policy. And it is, of course, the supplanting of traditional workplace relationships, the displacement of further displacement of labor, because of automation and AI. This will principally affect, in the first instance, industrialized countries, and it will, I think, force a rethink of the social safety net. I don't think most industrialized countries have come to terms yet with just how profound the disruption will be in terms of social cohesion and the types of public policy tools that will have to be developed to respond to these challenges in their societies. So technology is going to make so many things easier, and it will usher in things that we could not have imagined could be done before, but they will come with great stresses both domestically and between countries.
Professor Peng from UT Dallas.
Dear Senator Wu, my name is Mike Peng. I don't know if you remember, we met many years ago in this very room, about 2009, when the Jack F. Austin Center was set up. Both you and I came as part of the festivities. So we just wish you can be here with us. So my question for you, in addition to thanking you, is what is the Canadian perspective? You're now based in Ottawa, right? So I'm sure this is debated among your colleagues in Ottawa. So what's the Ottawa viewpoint from a political or geopolitical standpoint, and also from a Canadian company standpoint? What is the Canadian perspective? I mean, we all come here to learn, in addition to debating, discussing about the global knowledge, but we're also interested in knowing the Canadian perspective. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peng. I just saw a glimpse of you, so it's nice to see you briefly and to hear your voice. Welcome back to Vancouver. First of all, I don't represent the government of Canada. I'm an independent senator, so my views should be taken as simply that. Well, I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, the principal preoccupation in this country with respect to our international economic relationships was to preserve and protect our privileged position in the North American space, particularly market access to the United States, which was severely challenged during the Trump administration. And that challenge led Canada to frantically try to renegotiate NAFTA in a way that minimized our losses, if I can put it that way. I mean, I'm putting it somewhat negatively, but I think that's not an unfair characterization. It could have been a lot worse. Trump could have torn up NAFTA, of course, but he also could have pushed for a much less favorable agreement that we ended up with. But that focus is both sensible and necessary because Canada relies so heavily on the US market for our livelihood. Unfortunately, even after Trump, some of these challenges and the priority given to focusing on the US has not gone away because we continue to have difficulties in our trade and investment relationship with the Americans, where, as I pointed out in my speech, there is a growing protectionism in American trade policy that will affect Canada very profoundly. The so-called infrastructure bill has a variety of Buy America provisions in it that we believe violate our trade agreement, but which clearly indicate how the Americans think about Canada, and they don't think of Canada as being within the fortress, if I can put it that way. Even the agreement that we signed with the Americans, the CUSMA agreement, had a number of provisions that reduced Canada's degrees of freedom in terms of sourcing product from other countries. Rules of origin were tightened in terms of Canada's ability to negotiate new free trade agreements, and just narrowed the scope for action. So until we get some get more comfort in our securing our trade relationship with the US, I think a lot of the energy of our government is going to be on anticipating problems to come, fighting fires, building relationships so that we can prevent other problems that may loom. And this will, of course, distract from an effort to build trading and investment relationships with other parts of the world. Having said that, the government believes in the importance of diversification. We have a trade agreement with the EU. We are part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Agreement, CPTPP, and we are launching trade negotiations with a variety of countries, including with India. I will say, though, that a lot of the trade activity outside of North America seems to be premised on the idea that we need to decouple from China, whether for our own sake or for the sake of satisfying American priorities. And that, to me, is problematic in the sense that while I believe that while one can have a China strategy that does not involve much else of Asia, one can't really have an Asian strategy without involving a lot of China. And I just fear that the momentum to disengage with China is driving a lot of our thinking on international trade issues.
Thank you very much. Let me just go to one of the questions from the online audience, and then we have Professor Cuervo Casurra and Professor, I don't remember your name, sorry. So first the question from Cheng Li, who is saying, thank you for the great talk. What do you think governments and regulators can do to help firms, we are all from business schools, to buffer some of these geopolitical economic risks that you mentioned? And I may add, governments have always had the upper hand, but do governments are going to be an even bigger, higher hand, are going to be more powerful in the power of companies that during this very liberal period have had a lot to say, will be diminished?
Yeah, well, first of all, the work of all of you, in demonstrating the importance of openness and the benefits of globalization. I'm not an unabashed supporter of globalization and not blind to its deficits, but it has been very good for the world, particularly for the poor countries in the world and for Canadians. And it's important that scholars who understand that speak out and make their views known. Likewise, the business community has to speak out as well in telling politicians, policymakers, about the economic interests that they are supposed to protect, and why having access to markets around the world and allowing access in Canada for products and services and investment from around the world is good for Canada and good for our partner countries.
The two last questions. So Professor Cuervo Casurra, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's fantastic. Something I'd like to do is seek your advice regarding global commons. And the idea will be, yes, we might be going towards a multipolar world, but at the same time we have to deal with global commons. I'm thinking mostly climate change. I'm thinking about nature, oceans, things like this. Is this going to be, if you want, a counterbalance, or are we really doomed towards conflict and between two spheres.
Yeah, it's trite to say that climate change is a global problem and can only be solved through global cooperation, but that is so patently true. And if there's one thing that particularly young people understand very well, is that we cannot be nationalistic about our approach to solutions to carbon emissions. And I'm somewhat hopeful that if we focus on this existential threat to humanity, which is climate change, that will provide some mitigation to the very powerful and growing forces of division in this world that are driving countries and regions to not cooperate. So climate change, one hopes is a way to really shake us out of our complacency and to say we simply cannot go it alone, and we cannot operate in silos, and we have to work and talk to the countries and the regions and the counterparts that we may not agree with for political and other reasons. So I'm really hoping that the provision of what you call the commons, the regional and global commons, is a way in which we can think our way out of the growing geopolitical strife that we're facing. And it will take, I think, it will not come from the superpowers. I'm hopeful that middle powers, perhaps Canada and other countries, that can only survive if there is an adherence to the international rule of law, and where the superpowers are somewhat kept in check. If the middle powers step up to provide some leadership in stressing the importance of regional and global public goods and cooperation to that end.
Okay, Professor Meyer, the last question.
I'm Klaus Meyer, now at Ivy Business School. Senator Wu, we also have met before, similar to Mike Peng, actually in this very same building many years ago. I want to ask you Canadian competitiveness. To Mike Peng's question, you talked about the political dependency, let's say, political economic dependence of Canada on the US. Having been in Canada for 4 years, what I observe is Canadian companies are internationally not very competitive, notwithstanding what my Canadian colleagues say. Canadians are competitive in oil and gas, which is a sector that's under pressure, not just from geopolitics, but also from climate change considerations. Canadian banks think they're great, but actually they're not very competitive when it comes to highly intensive competitive places like the other London and New York. And there are very few other companies in technology niches. How does Canadian companies, now really focus on companies rather than political actors, how can they play a bigger role in the global stage other than in the primary sector?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'm going to duck the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, it's nice to see you again, by the way. Thank you for the question. I'm going to duck the question a little bit and focus on public policy, because that's what I do now. And I think there are, in fact, a number of important public policy initiatives that we can take to help Canadian businesses be more competitive, to force them to be more competitive, not just in the Canadian market or even the North American market, but globally. And it starts, I think, with competition policy. I'm part of a group that's pushing for a closer look at the Competition Act and competition policy more broadly. We need to make our marketplace friendlier and less daunting for new entrants to a variety of industries, particularly where digitization is concerned. Because what we do know is this: there are many very innovative and forward-looking Canadian companies, startups and young companies, but many of them have had to pursue their success and their growth outside of Canada because we don't have the enabling environment for them to thrive here. And what often happens is that they end up becoming companies that are domiciled in the United States or China or the EU or some other jurisdiction. And so the problem, I think, is not so much that we don't have the innovation and the entrepreneurial drive as such, but we haven't created the environment for homegrown companies to thrive, to compete with the incumbents in Canada, and therefore to develop the critical mass that will allow them to also compete internationally.
Thank you very much, Senator Gu, because these excellent remarks and also will inform us our discussions and very important for a conference on geopolitics and global strategies and emerging markets. Thank you very, very much.